Welcome everyone to this session on resilience, capability and capacity. I'd like to introduce our panellists. Firstly, John Lamb, Interim Director and immediate past President of the Local Government Technical Advisors Group.
Hello.
Hi, John. And next, Dr. Hugh Deeming, founder of HD Research. Welcome, Hugh. Graham Pendlebury, former Director of Local Transport at the Department for Transport. Welcome, Graham. And our moderator, Sir Nick Cary, Director of Waysphere Transport Intelligence. Hi, Nick. Welcome. And Nick and panellists, over to you.
An ever-present threat of death from flooding hangs over the residents of Calderdale. So said a report that sought to shore up flood defences in the Calder Valley, published by West Yorkshire's Calderdale Council in the wake of the 2015 Boxing Day floods in the valley. Such threats are an increasing reality in many parts of the UK as extreme weather events become more common. Today, we're going to have a conversation with three individuals who joined each other on a journey that began in the Calder Valley in 2015. 7 months before the Calder floods, John Lamb had joined Calderdale as interim head of highways and engineering. John, how did you first become aware of the floods?
Well, there's always been an ever-present recognition of the danger of flooding in the Calder Valley. And leading up to Christmas, we were keeping a weather eye on events. So there was already a good understanding that some flooding could occur. But it was Boxing Day. So I nipped upstairs into the study and had a look at some of the online river gauges of the River Calder.
What did you do next?
Well, I was alarmed, very alarmed, that record levels were being reported in the upper valleys, and then 30, 40 minutes later, these were starting to hit the gauges downstream.
So what sort of picture emerged about the devastation and the threat to life?
Well, what transpired was a major event, and as became clear through the journey that I with others went on, the picture was not always very clear. The call centres started to get very busy. It was out of hours. It was Boxing Day, and they were jammed with callers. But at 10:30, that morning, I spoke to one of the on-site highway technicians, and he made a throwaway comment that this is worse than 2012, and that was a summer cloudburst, which is a different kind of flooding, very, very sudden, very, very rapid, and that was meant to be a 1 in 100 year event. So everyone felt, well, that was it for 100 years. Little did we know, and it underlined that even for myself as a senior practitioner, that we can get sucked into that popular wisdom about what is a repeat event. And as we found, it's just as likely that you're going to get a further 1 in 100 year event, or even a 1 in 1,000 year event, as we saw up in Cumbria, a year or two after a previous event. So what transpired over the next 12 hours was 3,000 homes and businesses flooded. A river that became weaponized with trees, rubbish, and even a minibus.
So you obviously were very alert to it, and you responded extremely quickly, but you were there in a much more general service director job. So what sort of prior experience had you had of these types of events?
So as an interim director, I'm often thrown into the deep end, not quite this deep, but I think it is about having those wider references and those wider experiences. But 10 years in aviation, I was involved with the UK's longest running aviation hijack, and tragically the 747 cargo crash over at Stansted. But more typical highway-related events that many people in the sector will be aware of. But what was striking was that Calderdale made a deep impression in terms of both the homes and the livelihoods that were impacted, the very smell of communities that were that were devastated, the months that it took for communities to dry out, and these were people's livelihoods and homes. So what played out over the next few months made a deep impression to me, and it weighed heavily in terms of what I felt I needed to do next.
So what did it trigger? What did you feel you needed to do next?
So I needed to validate in the first instance, was this really just a one-off? Was it just another 1 in 100-year event? And if so, well, there's 154 highway authorities. So statistically, and that's just in England, add in the Welsh, the Scottish and Northern Ireland, and somewhere across the UK, there's going to be 2 or 3 communities like this, statistically speaking, who are going to be getting hit every single year. But for me, there was a need to scale up because it was very lonely being in Calderdale. Not the fact that other Calderdale colleagues weren't with me, they were, and they all stepped up massively, but it was one highway authority, or so I thought at the time, and therefore there was a need to sense check with colleagues where expertise lay nationally and how might we start to skill up.
So you felt there needed to be a national approach?
There needed to be something above the local. There was clearly some great shared experiences from those floods, mainly across Northern England, but Northern Ireland got a glancing blow, and Southwest Scotland, Dumfries and Galloway got very severely hit as well. That didn't strike me at the time, but they did in terms of Scotland. But that winter storm damage topped 1.6 billion, and to be clear, in the United Nations definition of the terms, it was a disaster. So for me, we need to scale up, we needed to skill up, and we needed to be better.
Graham, I gather John approached you at DFT soon after the floods. What was the department's position on these at the time?
Well, thanks, Nick, and hi, everybody. I mean, in the first instance, in DFT, we were focused very much on the immediate response, just as colleagues in local government were. So in our case, that's often thinking about funding requirements. But it's also very important for us to make sure that we're keeping the flow of information going, both with the local authorities dealing with the issues, but getting the information flowing in the upwards direction to ministers and cabinet committees and so forth. So there's always that kind of like headlong rush of activity. John obviously came in and as part of his approach to the department, talked a little bit about the need for this, what you might call a kind of unified training package, and that was something that was mooted quite early on, but obviously that then sort of evolved through discussion as the immediate crisis had passed away.
So my experience of working in government, Graham, and looking across to your area as being sort of very relevant to my work, made me feel that it was often challenging to achieve a swift, coordinated response across government departments to a new initiative if that was proposed by a third party. Can you give us a bit of context of the wider government setting?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right there, Nick, and I know that can be very frustrating for people, when they're approaching government in these trying circumstances, because the speed of response is an issue for Whitehall, because the Whitehall processes do tend to move relatively slowly, although there are reasons why that is, and one of them is the fact that there are obviously different government departments with, if you like, overlapping responsibilities. So, you've got Cabinet Office thinking about national resilience overall, DFT thinking about highways issues specifically, Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government thinking about local resilience, and so on and so forth. And so there's a need to kind of marshal all that and bring all that together and make sure people aren't treading on each other's toes. I think you also have to remember that there's public money at stake here, so we have to be mindful that we're not setting awkward precedents or taking arbitrary decisions about public funds. And I think really the final kind of thing I would say is that you know, Whitehall always needs to be clear that there's a genuine problem here that needs central government intervention rather than can be dealt with locally, and therefore that there is a proper process for deciding what steps need to be taken. Because we're always very mindful of the fact that you know, there needs to be evidence of what you might call a market failure for government to want to intervene in what can be quite localised issues, and all that flows from that.
So given this, Graham, what made you see the value of John's approach, given the competition for voice? You know, you're a busy government department, you have to filter a lot of this stuff. What made you see the value? Yeah,
that's right. I mean, I hope you won't mind me saying, but John's quite good at this kind of thing. I mean, first of all, he's quite good at sort of navigating his way through and finding the right people to talk to in Whitehall, and particularly in DFT, because he is quite networked, well networked, you know, in the department, and that is important. But to borrow a phrase that you just used there as well, John's very good at surmounting this problem of the competition for voice. You know, every day government departments get people coming in with ideas, problems, wanting money, wanting government intervention, this, that, and the other. So we've got so many of these competing voices. And what John successfully did is he came in with a problem, but also with at least a proposal or an outline for a solution. That's one thing, not just a problem and then, you know, for government to sort of sort it out. And secondly, John was quite good at making the intellectual case as well as the emotional case for the intervention that was needed. And so that starts to kind of, you know, trigger a positive response from us. Now, having said that, I mean, there was some parallel thinking going on in DFT at the time about the issues that John was bringing to us, because as he's already mentioned, we'd seen weather-related incidents from, you know, as far apart as Somerset, north of England, coastal storm surges and so forth. So we'd seen these things happening. We'd seen that some local authorities understandably were struggling to cope with and then recover from these sorts of instances. And then, you know, I guess the final thing is that with all the concerns about climate change and so forth, I guess we had a recognition in the department that these sorts of events were going to become more frequent, and therefore, as part of a wider, if you like, adaptation strategy, we needed to think about ways in which we could you know, build up or strengthen local resilience in the face of these kind of increasingly regular events.
So I'd like to turn to Hugh. We've learned from Graham, Hugh, that he was interested in supporting John's efforts to develop local authority resilience capability. Tell us a bit about your background and why you decided to assist John with his programme.
I mean, my background originally, I was a police officer for a number of years. Then I went back to university, and I sort of developed my academic basis at looking at community resilience, which doesn't necessarily match across to what we're looking at until you think of the highways sector as a community of practice. So we have community lessons to be learned. And what my initial work in Cumbria ended up with me being commissioned to look at the Storm Desmond impacts, and I was commissioned by Cumbria to look at both the acute and the recovery from Storm Desmond. That left significant reports came out of that. I was then asked to sit on the Kerslake panel into the arena review, and then back towards highways. My work in Cumbria led to DFT commissioning me to do the extreme events review 2015 to 2020, which has been done. As well as that, I worked with the Cabinet Office and I did a training needs assessment within the resilience sector, and it became pretty obvious that highways isn't the only local authority sector, or the only non-blue light sector that is struggling with this concept of resilience and working both during emergencies and throughout what we call the integrated emergency management cycle, which takes you from anticipating to right the way through to recovery. So it's been very interesting for me working with John for the last couple of years now, just thinking about this community of practice approach and how we can build resilience into the sector. Because at the end of the day, highways authorities, category 1 responders, in exactly the same sense that the police, fire and ambulance are. So their competencies need to be fully up to speed.
So why do you think local authorities need to get more involved in their response approach, given that, as you've alluded to, the blue light organisations are quite dominant?
I was thinking about this, and I didn't really have a peg to hang it on until last November, when FEMA in the US published their community lifeline guidance. You think of community lifelines as health, your IT, your energy networks, and your transport networks. And of course,
sorry, who's FEMA?
The Federal Emergency Management.
Okay, thank you.
Agency, who deal with all the emergencies across the US, and they issued community lifeline guidance for the first time, and it suddenly gelled. And I'm looking at a sector now, the highway sector, understand that out of all those lifelines, they're a fundamental one, because the highway network either protects or it connects the other critical infrastructure. So thinking of the highways authorities as Cat 1 responders, they need to be right at the front table.
What's your reaction, John, to Hugh setting out the stall?
So for me, the wider context and backdrop that Hugh provided has been absolutely invaluable, because as highway people, we are predisposed to get out there and help our local communities, and each and every local highway authority the best it can in terms of the events as they transpire. However, in terms of the scale and frequency of events, it is not going to be possible to continue to operate in the way that we have done. Also, we're already seeing the issue of corporate memory impact the ability to respond. So the corporate memory between 2012 and 2015 in Calderdale had already started to fade, but we therefore needed to understand that if we're going to think differently and be better, then we needed to scale up. And for me, what was quite stark was, whilst I, as a local authority and you know, even when I was in the private sector, I was still aware of the emergency apparatus. For me, local resilience forums, they were not something that at the senior most level within highway authorities, unless we have those functions of the LRF, the Local Resilience Forum, have we taken them seriously. Up until Calderdale, I had never been to an LRF meeting. It was something that a chap, and it usually was a chap, former retired Bobby or something like that, in the corner, working off to a different corporate director. And that to me underlined why, as local authorities, we needed to be joined up within a local authority as much as anything else. And for me, that LRF dimension was really important, because highwaymen will go out and respond to an incident, but unless we're doing it increasingly within the context of the 40 or so local resilience forums, we will not be complying in the way that we should be to the civil contingencies requirements. And within that, some of the constructs that I am finding really helpful in terms of how we develop highway network resilience.
So you set Hugh a challenge. What have you and Hugh been doing together?
Well, I think we've along the way, we've been just collectively challenging each other in terms of the different sectors, and often it's that cross-fertilization of ideas where two sectors that have been separate, they come together, and it is where maths no longer applies. 1 + 1 does not equal 2. And when you look at that, you start to look at 2 or 3 different events, and depending on what it hits first, you can actually start to get multiples of different events. So if you've got 20 or 30 different kind of events that sit on a risk register held by a local authority or held by the Local Resilience Forum, when you start to look at those within a highway perspective, it actually results in tens of thousands of different permutations, and it is not possible to prepare for all of those. But by looking cross-sector and the work that Hugh has been engaged with, it does make me rethink how I reskill my teams. Hugh.
And that's an interesting one. You talk about the community risk register, which may have thousands of computations about different risks. But if we think about, obviously I talk about Cumbria quite a lot because I've been embedded in their experience in Storm Desmond, but for several years now they've used the concept of common consequences. And common consequences are things that multiple risks will produce. And the first one on their list is transportation problems. So this all feeds in the same direction.
One of the things that I did find, and I know DFT asked me just to sense check that others within the field, either Cabinet Office or the MHCLG, their RED, Resilience and Emergencies Directorate, it got me thinking that surely there's someone else doing this, and it was a bit like I'm an imposter. Here I am, a highwayman, just because I got a little bit wet. Well, I didn't, because I was in my office in Boxing Day, but just because I had experience of it, I thought surely across the sector other people are doing it, and therefore with the challenges from DFT, just to say, look, you know, we really do need to evidence all of this, and Hugh's work helped, but you know, reaching out to networks such as Solace, the Society of Local Authority Chief Execs, the Local Government Technical Advisors Group, LCRIG, ADEPT, the Local Government Association, it became clear to me that there was no other single body championing this, and that did mean that when I did go back to Graham, and I'd meet Graham sort of 4 or 5 times a year under different guises, it was a case of saying, look, actually there is a problem here, there is an opportunity here, and no one else is doing it.
You've identified. I mean, Graham already said, John, that you know you're great at identifying useful networks. What targeted you in the direction of the ones that you've mentioned, and how have you sort of progressed your ideas through those networks?
So I think within the context actually of some of the work that the Department for Transport did in terms of self-assessment, which applies to English authorities outside London, so you then start to get a diminishing pool of organisations. If you're outside London, the DFT will formally request you to answer certain key questions in terms of your resilience, and I did start to ask certain local authorities, well, how did you respond to these questions on the self-assessment? And it was quite clear that you get many authorities who would say, oh, absolutely, yeah, we've responded to that. And then I'd say, well, you had a flood, a bit of a flood a year or so ago. Have you reviewed your resilient network? And they say, oh no, we've not. And yet it's quite clear in terms of the criteria that says if you have had a flood, you are required to review the resilient network, and it makes sense to do it within the context of the local resilience forum, and to sense check the lessons learned. What was quite clear was that many local authorities, many highway authorities were not doing it, whereas some were actually increasingly adept at doing this. Cumbria in particular, North Yorkshire had got some considerable best practice, and Calderdale, you know, massive experience that had been gained and was being embedded. So for me, it was about looking at those events that did transpire over the period of Hugh's review for the DFT between 2015 and early this year, 2020, and seeing the nature of those responses coming through, and the way in which network resilience did need to be made on a more consistent and a much greater footing.
Thanks, John. I want to ask on behalf of local authorities, since we are part of the local authority hub, who are the key targets in local authorities that you've identified, and Why do they need particularly to get involved in this?
So the Department of Transport require the Section 151 officer and the Director of Highways to sign off the return to the DFT in terms of the self-assessment. When you look at the responsibilities and you look at the lessons to be learned from, tragically, coroner's inquiries into people that have died on the network, either people who were walking or people who've driven into floods and died, it is quite clear that there are implications that go all the way to the top. So for me, the network that I have built around me and Hugh are directors and chief officers, and from that, within their organisations down to the front line, you create that golden thread starting at the top, and of course the supply chain, because our sponsor Ringway, they actually operate as an intelligent client for some of the largest shire authorities, and they themselves have a role to play along with other service providers.
Graham, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It's fascinating listening to John and Hugh telling their story, and I think you know, in DFT, you know, my former department, but I think I can still speak for them, we do strongly believe in localism and in devolution. And what's attractive about the work that John in particular has done is that he has embarked upon something which is not about diluting the kind of competence or responsibilities of local authorities. It's actually the reverse. It's about building up capability and building up resilience, so that what DFT, and this will be true of other government departments, do is we avoid the situation where a major issue is happening in a local area. The local authority or the other kind of, you know, competent bodies in the area are really struggling to cope, and so the government then steps in, and then suddenly it becomes the government's problem. And that's not the kind of situation that we find ourselves comfortable in. And actually, it's not the right way to go in a world of localism and devolution. So this, you know, this is a really useful program, I should say, you know, for DFT, because it is about strengthening and building resilience and building capability across local government, rather than a kind of a reliance on central government intervening, you know, with increasing frequency. That's not to say that there won't be circumstances where central government will need to, you know, step in and help out. I mean, we will always fully accept that, and there will be public demands and so forth, you know, for occasions when that needs to do. But at least we can, you know, we can help to build capability in the area, and that's why I think this program is a really good one. I think that the issue that often kind of bedevils us is we made a start with this, but it's about, you know, how do you build this for the long term? Because, you know, programs are being developed and everybody's, you know, danced and shouted for joy that we've got the answer, but then it kind of degrades and erodes over time. And I know that's something that we all need to kind of keep working on and thinking about how we actually build some longevity into the program, the work that's been done.
I think John and Hugh's energy and intellectual capability to grip this is really impressive. But I think that that warning is obviously incredibly relevant. So, what is your advice, Graham, to John and Hugh about how you keep building and how you keep the program alive?
Yeah, thanks. I kind of walked into that one, didn't I? I mean, you know, when you think about it, if you go back to the 2012 London Olympics and what a, you know, fantastic success they were, and one of the most successful elements of that was the way in which the transport system worked, thanks to all the different players who were involved in that, public and private sector. And one of the great things that we saw there was the shift to more active travel modes during the run up to and during the Olympics themselves. And, you know, in DFT, we had all these maps everywhere showing how easy it was to walk from A to B rather than getting on a bus or taking a taxi or something like that. But then actually, we didn't properly embed those lessons. networks probably right across the sector, and they've probably faded away. You know, the maps were taken down, you know, within days after the end of the Olympics, and everybody reverted back to, you know, to poorer practice. So it is a real issue about longevity. And I mean, I guess there are kind of sticks and carrots. I mean, the carrots are, you know, there are some great networks already in existence, and John has described some of them through the various kind of, you know, pan local government bodies. And I would actually give a shout out for the UK Roads Liaison Group, which actually brings in not just central government and local government in England, but it also includes the devolved governments and local government in Scotland, Wales, the devolved government in Northern Ireland. So, because this is not just an England issue, this is absolutely a UK-wide issue. And you know, so everybody, you know, so there are networks and ways in which you can keep promoting and keep kind of banging the drum about why this is a really important and valuable thing to do. But I mean, there are sort of, I wouldn't like to, perhaps not sticks isn't quite the right word. I mean, and John again has mentioned the fact that DFT, we do surveys every year checking on winter preparedness. You know, what are the salt stock levels in local authorities? You know, how ready are local authorities for, you know, inclement weather when it arises? And if you like, if the satisfactory answers are not forthcoming, then we can make life a bit more difficult for some of those local authorities. So I think, you know, there are ways in which we can continue to prod and ask questions about, are you doing this? Because, by the way, if you have another weather-related incident, and it's going to happen sooner or later, and you're found wanting, when all these support packages have been available, that's not going to look good, is it? You know, don't come running to us, in a sense, you know, for a helping hand when we're actually in a position, you know, supporting, you know, the program that John's established, you know, to make sure that we are better prepared. But I mean, I'm hoping it doesn't come to that kind of thing. But I mean, I guess there are a mixture of sticks and carrots, but hopefully the program will sell itself, because it will actually, you know, deliver, you know, a real benefit for authorities, and they won't need, you know, a stick to beat them to require them to go along to these things.
I think what is quite clear is that embedding resilience is something that we've already seen people are keen to do. Again, I guess with that imposter syndrome that I keep having, that surely someone's already doing this elsewhere. We did just before COVID, we did do a beta test of the course overnighter, where we talked through with some very senior sector leaders drawn from UKRLG and others known to us, and we walked through what the content was. How do we actually skill people up? How do we skill the sector? It's a very personal journey that each and every one of us will go through. And we were, Hugh and I were taken aback in terms of how relevant it was to senior practitioners. We do not want this to be just seen as another course, another certificate. What I do find, and I find it highly relevant for me as an interim director going in to troubleshoot and solve problems, is that it created for me a new lens or a filter through which to look at service change, because if you can actually create resilience and you can look at those common consequences of what happens in terms of our actions, our responses, how we can support the community to step up. What Hugh and I are now finding is that we need to support the sector in ways that have not really been given any airtime, and that go above and beyond the current training course that will start post-COVID. Once we've got this disaster out of the way, we can start preparing for the next one. But Hugh and I are already starting to look at the tools and systems that are available to support frontline operatives safely in the field, operate to a consistent and high quality approach and methodology to say, look, what is the issue? What are the community lifelines? One of the key points that Hugh talked about in terms of international best practice. But to be clear, what Hugh and I are looking at here, and it's quite scary, is that there is nowhere across the world's road body that looks at highway network resilience in the way that we are now doing, in terms of of clear and consistent reporting from the front line back to the depot, straight through to your portfolio holders, local politicians, and if need be, to report those in a managed way up to the local resilience fora or other regional bodies, and actually all the way up to COBRA, to Cabinet Office, and DFT, so that you can have a golden thread in terms of what's actually happening, so that you can actually respond. Because if, you know, stitch in time, I firmly believe that had we have got in there quicker in Calderdale and perhaps in other areas, then the catastrophic damage, 130 million pounds worth of damage in Cumbria, and the 25-30 million pounds worth of damage, network damage in Calderdale, could have been less had we have had that heads up on the approach that we're now looking at. So if we do it at a community level, then we can respond better, we can respond more quickly, and where we do need to scale up at a regional level or at a government level and need to call in the Chinooks, which are not always the best answer. Hugh has explained this to me on many occasions. There are other better support mechanisms from within our supply chain partners to actually get a swifter, more local response that does not cost £25,000 an hour like a Chinook does.
Of course, we've got several organisations, they've been referenced earlier in this discussion, blue light organisations who are there to deal with incidents and respond. Over the years, I think we've heard quite a lot about how even they have technical and organisational challenges communicating with each other, but they present us with a model. So Hugh, how far have you got with getting blue light organisations to engage with local authorities?
And if we look at one particular bit of doctrine in the emergency services, which includes all category 1, category 2 responders, the joint emergency services interoperability principles, the 5 principles: co-location, communication, coordination, joint understanding of risk, and shared situational awareness. 5 fundamental principles of managing just the response of an incident. Those principles were written in 2013. By 2016, they still weren't embedded across the 3 emergency services. This normalization of practice takes time, and having the hat that you can put on, you're a Cat 1 responder, the same as the emergency services, it should be making people want to be proudly competent in integrated emergency management as part of their role. Their day job's busy enough, but my goodness, it becomes hard when you're faced with an emergency and you're not quite sure what the protocols are. So it's a really important area of competency that highways professionals need to have.
So what do you think slows down this learning?
I always say, I was always taught that anecdote isn't data, but my anecdote is last year I was invited up to a MACA Military Assistance to the Civil Authorities Day, Capabilities Day in North Yorkshire. Room full of people, majority of them in uniform, different coloured uniforms, 2 people from the highways sector. And the point of that day was to introduce the responder partners to the capabilities, the military capabilities that are on tap. Again, going back to John's point, sometimes they're not the best, but my goodness, the conversations that could have been had with those military specialists to make friends before you needed them, rather than have that knowledge coming through a conduit of your resilience team. If you actually speak to the people, you know what's there waiting for you if you need it. And it's
Yes.
putting the sector needs to put itself forward into learning opportunities and networking opportunities within integrated emergency management circles.
I think a lot of that is also, it is best played out at the local level. It is in the place where things happen, where trade takes place, learning occurs, happiness is created. It's within and at the heart of local communities. And it is at that point where if you can get blue light services and yellow light services, and one of the key things that I stress throughout the work that I've been doing is that on any day, there are more yellow light services within local authorities, in local communities, than can ever be deployed by the blue light services. So the blue light services will be able to provide certain support, but it is, as Graham was saying earlier, about local support, local capacity, and you can, and I say this as a hard-pressed local authority director, where there have been cuts, but there's still a lot of goodwill. We can only do so much, but when you look at the team leaders, the heads of service, the depot managers, the chief officers and the directors, looking at resilience through a new lens or a new filter, then you can, for a period, sustained over a few days, you can actually guide and direct services in a way now, or through the course and through the training and experience that Hugh and I are bringing to bear, deploy resources to communities that in the past have taken days, if not weeks. And that has got to be for the better of those local communities that we are trying to save. And ultimately the lifelines that we are trying to keep in place if they are being inundated literally by Mother Nature through more frequent events and through more intense events.
On this issue, I think that's very clear. And on this issue, I think I picked up something which is a very simple message to transmit, which I think we can all sign up to, which is make friends before you need them. Yep. Graham, I wonder whether there's a final comment that you'd like to add to sort of underline what we've learned today.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. If I had one final comment to make, it would be about the importance that I would attach to, if you like, rehearsing and stress testing the processes and things that you've got in place for dealing with a weather-related event or some other sort of, disastrous thing that happens in your community. So, for example, it's very, very important, and I think we're not very good at doing this necessarily in this country, that you have an honest kind of appraisal, that you put people through their paces, see how they respond to this emerging crisis, and then if there are weaknesses and flaws, that's fine, because you've then got the opportunity to kind of rectify those, maybe even, put some themes into the program that John's developed that maybe address any particular issues that have arisen, but making sure that people within local authorities or other organisations have tried out and practiced and tested their kind of resilience capability in a kind of scenario, so that when the real thing happens, because it will happen, whatever circumstance it might be, it will happen. You then have got a sort of a tried and tested approach for dealing with it. So I guess that would be my principal kind of add-on as a final thought.
Thanks, Graham. I think you leave us with a really, really important thing to hold on to there. And thank you very much, everyone. It's been an extremely interesting session. I've learned a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick.